Good afternoon. We're on the Laws of Prayer. We're in Kuf Zayin Aleph 107.1, and we're in the middle. And we're talking about, let's say somebody wants to daven an extra Shemona Esrei. We know that there's a requirement to pray Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer, 3 times a day. But let's say someone is feeling very inspired and he wants to daven an extra Shemona Esrei. So practically, we really don't do this nowadays. And we'll discuss later why that is. But according to the letter of the law, you could do that. You could do it. Practically, we don't do it, but according to the letter of the law, you could add an extra Shemona Esrei. And the way you would do that is if you add a Chiddush, you would add something new to your Shemona Esrei. And that will also be discussed. What does it mean to add something new? So let's continue where we were in the Mishnah Berurah. Eino Choser, you're not allowed to daven an extra Shemona Esrei if you don't add something new. The Tfilos Keneged Tmidim Tiknum. The reason is because davening was instituted as a replacement for the sacrifices which were brought in the temple. And we don't want to bring an extra sacrifice that isn't necessary. There was a sacrifice brought in the morning and one in the afternoon. So if you start davening extra, it's like you're bringing an extra sacrifice in the temple, which is not allowed. If the Torah says you're not allowed to add in the Torah, we can't just create more mitzvos and create more things. That's a prohibition of Baal Tosef. We're not allowed to add onto the Torah. This is actually a case. Let's say you don't think you're going to be able to make a minyan, so you start davening by yourself. And you daven Shemona Esrei, and then you realize, oh, there's a minyan nearby, but I didn't get to daven with a minyan. So even in that case, you're not allowed to go daven again, even though you could get a mitzvah of davening with a minyan. Since you already prayed, you're not allowed to pray again. Umispal b'nedava. So, however, you are allowed to do a tfilas nedava. There's a difference. When you pray l'shem chova, which means I'm praying to fulfill my obligation of davening today, that you're only allowed to do the set amount of times, which is 3 times a day. But let's say you want to do something at tfilas nedava, a voluntary prayer because you love Hashem so much. That you're allowed to do, but you have to add something in the Shemona Esrei. So again, just to add, practically we don't do this nowadays, but we're still going to learn the halachas of the letter of the law if you're allowed to do it. Perish dafkum nedava av l'shem chova afilu b'chidish aser. But to do it as a required Shemona Esrei, to do it again, that's forbidden, even if you add something to the Shemona Esrei. V'had be'inin chidish b'nedava de al yedei chidish minkar merteiches tilaso hi l'shem tachnunim v'lo l'shem chayva v'lo chidish machzik misha osa l'shem chova. The reason we have to add something to the Shemona Esrei, if we want to add Shemona Esrei during the day, is because we have to make it apparent that the reason I'm davening again is because I want extra mercy from Hashem, not because, and I'm not doing it because as an extra requirement. To make it clear, I'm not adding on to what we are required to do. Now, of course, a person's allowed to pray the entire day as much as he wants. We're talking about specifically davening the set prayer of the Shemona Esrei, which appears in the Siddur. And if you're just praying and you add something new, then you're allowed to do that. Mitfilas Musaf, we said that let's read the Shulchan Aruch here. You're not allowed. Now, that which we said you're allowed to daven again, voluntary prayer, when you add something new, that's just a regular Shemona Esrei. But you're not allowed to do that with the special Shemona Esrei of Musaf on Shabbos or holidays. Even for the Musaf prayer of Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed, Kevin she'omer u'musafim kil chasam u'musafim enim krevim elam mishal tzibor ve'ena yachad yachal lenadev osam. We mentioned that the Shemona Esrei is in place of the sacrifices brought in the temple. So certain sacrifices a person is allowed to bring as an individual. Certain sacrifices were offered in the temple as a communal sacrifice, meaning the Kohen sacrificed it for the entire Jewish people, and certain sacrifices a person could bring to the temple himself, whether it's a Thanksgiving sacrifice, those types of things, and the Kohen would offer it for him, but it was an individual sacrifice. So since the Musaf sacrifice was only brought by the congregation, a person isn't able to say individually that he wants to voluntarily bring a Musaf sacrifice, because an individual is not allowed to do that. So too, a person cannot voluntarily say an extra Musaf prayer. And therefore, Shabbos and Yontiv, one is not allowed to bring those personal sacrifices that someone could have brought in the temple. One cannot do that on Shabbos and Yontiv. We're not allowed to bring voluntary sacrifices on Shabbos and Yontiv. That involves malachas, involves forbidden labors on Shabbos. Only the required sacrifices we're allowed to do on Shabbos. So therefore, one is not allowed to offer a voluntary sacrifice. One is not allowed to do a voluntary prayer on Shabbos or Yontiv at all. Im nestapik im his palosam in a yachal lachsor lis palosam dehari tzarich lahasnos ukanabas of beis ubezeh in yachal lahasnos v'ayin lekamas mechov dalet be'ervach. Now this is something we mentioned earlier. Now we said at the beginning that we don't do these voluntary Shemona Esreis. We don't add extra Shemona Esreis nowadays. The reason is we're going to say is because nowadays it would be enough if we had intent and we focused on the prayers that we have to say. So if we would just keep praying and not having in mind what we're saying, Hashem is not so into that. But there is a very practical area where this halacha comes into play. Let's say you're not sure if you are required to daven again. For some reason, you're unclear if you davened already, or maybe you don't remember if you said a prayer that was required in the Shemona Esrei that day. So we mentioned last time, what do? You say, I'm going to daven now. And you make a condition in your head. If my previous Shemona Esrei was okay, then I'm praying now. My prayer now is a voluntary Shemona Esrei. And if my previous Shemona Esrei did not count, I am now praying to fulfill my obligation to pray. And we said that one's allowed to do. But since one is not allowed to bring a voluntary sacrifice on Shabbos and therefore can't do a voluntary Shemona Esrei on Shabbos, one can't make this condition on Shabbos. So what we mentioned before, where this halacha is very, very relevant, is if a person isn't sure if he has to daven Shemona Esrei, he has to make a condition that if he's not required to daven now, that his davening is a voluntary Shemona Esrei. But that can only be done during the week. On Shabbos, we can't do that. And the reason we can't do that on Shabbos is because we're not allowed to daven a voluntary Shemona Esrei on Shabbos. So if we weren't required, let's say we're on Shabbos and we're not sure if we davened or not. So we're not allowed to make the condition and say, well, if I already davened, what I'm davening now is going to be a voluntary Shemona Esrei. We can't do that because we're not allowed to say voluntary Shemona Esreis on Shabbos, but we could do that during the week. And this is a topic which will be discussed later. And it's very relevant because sometimes we're not sure if we have to go back and daven again, if we omitted something. We're not sure if we omitted it. Maybe there's a debate amongst the poskim if we have to go back or not. So we can make this condition. But this condition only works during the week, not on Shabbos. That's what we said. Afilu yachol. So the last thing we mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch was that if somebody, let's say you start praying, and in the middle while you're praying, you realize like, "Oy, I already prayed mincha," and you started praying. You're in the middle of Shemona Esrei, and you're davening mincha, and then in the middle of Shemona Esrei mincha, you say, "Oy, I already davened mincha at 1 o'clock. What am I doing?" So what do? So the Shulchan Aruch said, just stop where you are. Just stop davening. The reason is because when you started davening, you for sure had in mind that your davening was going to be as the required Shemona Esrei, because you thought you didn't daven yet. So you're not able to say, right, maybe you thought you could do this, right? I'm davening in the middle, and I realized I'm in the middle of my Shemona Esrei, and I realized I davened already. So what do? Oh, I'll add something in the Shemona Esrei to make this a voluntary Shemona Esrei. So the Mishnah Berurah says you can't do that since you started thinking mistama that I'm davening to fulfill my obligation for mincha. You can't transform the Shemona Esrei in the middle. Since you already started as a required Shemona Esrei, you're not allowed to do that. Because in the temple you can't bring a sacrifice that half is required and half is not required. So same thing with Shemona Esrei. Avalim hayalo safakim is pal v'hischel b'tnai ukanabasif beis niskar b'emsa sheis palo yishlam rid ein sar chidush v'gamer kach l'shem nedava. Teim sheketzu matchila kehogen adayte tesfek v'safek havik chidush su ein sar chidush b'levush mashma shegomer al yedei chidush efsheduhu al tzad yesu tov. So he says like this, that's only true if in the middle of the Shemona Esrei you realize that you daven, and when you started you thought you didn't daven, right? So until now we were talking about a case. I started davening Shemona Esrei. In the middle, I realized I davened. So then you just stop where you are. But what if the following? I started davening, and I made that condition because I'm really not sure. I can't remember if I daven mincha. So what do? we do what we mentioned earlier. We make this condition. We say we daven now, and we say, if I already daven, this is a voluntary Shemona Esrei. If I did not daven, this is an obligatory Shemona Esrei. But let's say in the middle, I remember, oh, you know what? I did daven earlier. So then the Mishnah Berurah says you can continue. You should continue. Since you started the Shemona Esrei with this condition, you can continue assuming that it is a voluntary Shemona Esrei. And he brings in Lavush that it's good, better, it's to add something to the Shemona Esrei. And we'll discuss tomorrow, Bli Neder, what exactly does it mean to add something to the Shemona Esrei. So I know today was a little bit technical, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out, and glad to go over it again. Have a beautiful day.